Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to the Old State House for today's program. Today we're continuing a year-long series called Choosing to Participate, Renewing Connecticut's Civic Health. We're able to do this thanks to financial support from Connecticut Humanities, which is funding all of our programs for the year. And we're doing it in support of a project that is being led by the Connecticut Secretary of the State's office, along with Everyday Democracy and other partners across the state. The project is called Connecticut Civic Health Index, which reports on Connecticut's active civic engagement in civic life and develops strategies to increase that engagement. We did a report in 2011 about Connecticut's civic health, and we'll be doing another one in early 2016. Because of this project, our programs are focusing on aspects of our civic health in this state. And the civic health indicators are really pretty simple and sometimes surprising to people. They are things like, do you talk to your family at dinner time? That's a sign of good civic health. Do we work with neighbors to solve problems? Do we vote? Do we register to vote? Do we donate to charity or do volunteer work? Do we participate in local government? Today, we're going to be exploring local government a little bit. It's something that affects all of our lives, and it's sometimes hard to know about it as you're going along from day to day. It's hard to keep track of what's going on locally, statewide, and nationally, but it's an important thing to keep track of. So we're going to explore local government today through a conversation with our panelists and with DIANE Smith, Connecticut's senior producer for program development. And at this point, I'd like to introduce DIANE.
Thanks, Sally. Thank you. So we are just about 2 weeks away from municipal elections in Connecticut, and there are a number of interesting races taking place, including several in large cities where incumbent mayors failed to get the endorsement of their parties. The one that's probably gotten the most attention is in Bridgeport, where former mayor and convicted felon Joe Ganim beat Mayor Bill Finch in a primary and may very well regain his seat at the head of the city government. Although local elections probably have the most impact on people's lives and local government too, municipal elections, the local ones, have the lowest turnout of any elections in Connecticut. So we thought it would be a good time to take a look at the history of local government in our state and its relevance to our lives today. Our speaker is Bruce Clouette, who has been active in Connecticut history and historic preservation for 30 years. He has a PhD in history from UConn and is the author of Bristol, Connecticut, 1785 to 1985, and The Healing Triangle, A History of Hartford Hospital, among other things. Bruce is also known for his exhibits on historical themes, including one that you may have seen. It's a permanent exhibit on the history of the Connecticut legislature, and it is at the Legislative Office Building in Hartford. So I'd like to introduce Bruce Clouette.
Thank you, Diane. This is a conversation that's going to start with history. And the reason I think history is a good place to start is because it's very empowering. When we look back at local government in the early national period, in the colonial period, at the time of Connecticut's founding, we see that many things are the same, many things are different. And what that tells us is we don't have to accept the status quo. These political institutions that affect our lives are things that we as a society create and we can modify as we need to. And I think over time we can see that, the citizens of Connecticut have modified their institutions. At least they've modified the balance of power and funding and responsibility over time. I'd like to just start by saying that Connecticut began as an affiliation of 4 towns: Wethersfield, Hartford, Windsor, and Spring. Oh, wait a minute, you're a ringer. I saw you talking earlier. You're a ringer, yeah. And the General Court of Massachusetts had some problem with Massachusetts town joining Connecticut, and they left the early discussions. But at any rate, the colonial government, the first colonial government, was formed by the towns. But very early on, the balance of power shifted to the general court. That's what the legislature was called. So many representatives from each town got together and they constituted the general court. And partly because there were many new towns that came about, that the general court took on the responsibility of creating towns. The first towns were created in part by recognizing that other settlements were going to be part of Connecticut, e.g. Old Saybrook and New London. Towns were added when New Haven, which had been a separate colony, joined Connecticut. That was in the first half of the 17th century. And finally, towns were created when an area that was a very large town, like Windsor, was broken up into smaller towns. So East Windsor, South Windsor, all those towns that are separate towns today originally were part of Windsor. Hartford included East Hartford and present-day Manchester and present-day West Hartford as well. So towns were broken up over time and made, as the population increased, made more manageable. But that was the general court that created those towns. There wasn't a whole lot of government at the colony level. There was a lot of government at the local level, but there wasn't a lot of government at the colony level. The chief function of the colonial government and then the state government in Connecticut was to make laws to regulate behavior, to run the judiciary, I already mentioned create towns, and run any external affairs of the colony, relations with other colonies, relations with the Indians, preparation for participation in the various colonial wars, etc. But there wasn't a great deal of state government that you could point to. In fact, because of what I just said about New Haven, the meeting of the legislature was alternated between Hartford and New Haven, one in the spring, one in the fall, and all the papers and records of the government fit in a single trunk through the 1850s. So that's how small state or colony level government was at this time. But that did not mean that the general court was powerless. In fact, quite the opposite. In making laws, what they did was tell the towns what their responsibilities were, what their powers were, and the towns then carried that out. We've heard a lot about unfunded mandates. This was totally unfunded mandates. The general court required towns to have certain town officers, required towns to take care of the poor, required towns to maintain schools, and also required the towns to enforce all state laws. There was no law enforcement, or colony laws. There was no law enforcement at the colony level, really. The selectmen, the constables, and the justices of the peace of the towns were the ones that enforced laws. There were a lot of laws. You've heard of the nanny state? Well, Colonial Connecticut was heavily into that nanny proposition. The one I liked most were laws against night walking. Night walkers were mostly teenagers who were out after sunset, totally verboten. And selectmen were authorized to round up night walkers and return them to the discipline of their parents. There were a whole lot of laws that basically governed behavior, not the least of which was the empowerment of the Congregational Church. One of the things that towns were required to do was to maintain one or more congregational societies. The meeting house was erected at public expense. The minister was paid out of local taxes. That arrangement persisted past the American Revolution right up till the Constitution of 1818. Some of the responsibilities of the town were actually transferred to the church societies, the most important being the supervision of schools. Church societies also dealt with a lot of personal behavior like adultery and drunkenness, etc., etc. Although the selectmen were empowered to enforce those laws as well. So let's look at what the colonial town was. There were three main officers. There was the clerk, there was the treasurer, and there were the selectmen, first called townsmen. And the townsmen or selectmen basically had authority over all the others. There were constables. There were real estate listers that would list people's property so it could be taxed. There were highway surveyors that maintained the roads, and they were given public funds and they would spend those to maintain the roads. There were three classes of citizens in the colonial era. We think you're either a voter or you're not a voter. Not that simple. There were proprietors. The early concept of a town was kind of mixed. It was partly a political unit, but it was partly a commercial enterprise. And that mixed conception of what a town was, the original settlers were called proprietors of the town. And if there was any future division of land, like the towns gave out house lots and fields and so forth to the proprietors, but a lot of it was not divvied up. Future divvying up of the land, it would go to the proprietors and to no one else. Well, this was not a particularly workable system because other people were very resentful when land was given to a small group of people. Plus, you had the whole thing of generations. Like 3 generations later, everybody in town is the descendant of one or more of the proprietors. So the distinction started to go. But as recently as the 1990s, some people in Lebanon claimed they were the proprietors and had a right not to accept the town's proposals for altering the town green. So that was number one. They met in a separate meeting and made their own decisions, kept their own records. Then there were the so-called freemen. The freemen were those who were allowed to vote in state or colony or state elections. And the requirements for freemen was you had to have a certain amount of property. I think at the end it was 30 pounds worth. And this is the most important thing. You had to be admitted as a freeman by the colonial legislature. That was probably the big impediment. The number one thing that defined local government for many years in Connecticut was difficulty in travel and communication. So if you can't have a lot of travel, you can't have a colony level or state level of government acting because it just took a long time to get somewhere or to learn about something. Lack of communication, lack of travel did empower, or at least require, that government be on a local level. So there were the freemen who elected state offices. Estimates vary from 10% to about 60% of adult males were admitted as freemen. But what I find most interesting is it's apparent that lots more people could have been freemen if they wanted to, but didn't bother to sign up or to ask to be admitted, which kind of shows they realize the important decisions are being made on the town level. So do I really want to go to 2 meetings on town meeting day or just 1? I'll just go to the town meeting. Finally, there was inhabitants. Inhabitants were the great mass of people, householders, again, men, head of households, who voted at the town meeting. The town meeting elected the local officers, the selectmen, the town clerk, the town treasurer. They were all elected at the town meeting. We know of at least one case in which an African-American person in Farmington was elected to local office in the 1600s. So even the sort of whites-only requirement was a little bit fungible, at least in the early days. But it was a very widespread democracy in theory. Eventually, the towns added more and more offices that they would elect at the town meeting. There were real estate listers, I mentioned that, constable, sealers of measure, the people that kept track of the brands on cattle, the inspectors of leather. In all, at the end of the colonial period, towns were electing between 75 and 100 people to different town offices. It was pretty much a participatory thing. In fact, many towns would find someone if they turned down an office. So we need so many sealers of leather, and you are going to be sealers of leather. You say, I don't want to be. You would get like a nominal fine, like £5 or something like that. So sometimes, especially someone that's been on a local nominating committee, I wish we could get back to finding people who refuse to run for public office, because on a local level, in many towns, it's hard to find people. It was a deferential democracy in that these elections were rarely contested. There was an expectation in the 18th century, even into the early 19th century, that the most... Put that down. Can you hear me without that? Okay. Oh, but it may affect the taping. I'm sorry. I'll leave it up. I'll just try not to swat it. Deferential democracy means that the most respected people were elected to offices. That's why the same people are selectmen over and over again. Some town clerks served for 30, 40, 50 years. It was this, people had an understanding and they were comfortable with it, that you just, these were the better sort, and you elected them and they agreed to take on this responsibility, etc. Even as the town government was quite large. Oh, okay, yeah, 5 minutes. Even as the town government was quite large, in the colonial and early national period, there were other levels of government, even more local. The chief one being the parishes. So you would have one congregational church in the center of town, but also 2, 3, or more in the outlying areas. Each of these parishes got a share of the taxes to support their own minister, to support their own schools, they got their own highway surveyors. In many cases, these minor offices, there were multiple holders and they were distributed among the parishes. So there was an even more local level of government. And that continued for a long time with the local school districts as well. Eventually this changed and the state grew. Why did the state grow? I think the state grew because society becomes more complex. You have railroads. How does a town regulate railroads and ensure safety? It doesn't. The state started regulating railroads in 1853. Insurance companies and insurance schemes, that was another thing that was regulated. Mental health. At a very early point in the 19th century, the state started to finance mental health institutions because the old system of the town taking care of the poor and the disturbed and so forth was really not working. Factory inspection, labor laws, institutions of higher education, UConn in 1881. As society becomes more complex, as cities grow, then the state begins to become more powerful. The state also grows because of crisis. The Depression was one such crisis when local governments went bankrupt. Suburbanization was another crisis when the towns had to build so many schools that the state basically got into the school building business, and it has been ever since. And finally, the 1960s, the deep divisions in society, the differences between blacks and whites, the differences between the poor and the wealthy, I think called forth a new role for the state beyond what the towns could do themselves. So the lesson of history is this. There have been many different varieties of government, local government. Some things have been done at this level, this level, this level over time. But we've always been able to come up with a distribution of power and responsibility that responds to the changing times. And I'm pretty confident that we will in the future as well. Thank you.
Okay. Any seats over there? Okay. So thank you for being here. Bruce, that was very interesting. There were a lot of things about that I had no idea. And in fact, I remember as a reporter at Channel 8 a number of years ago, there were proprietors in the 1990s in New Haven. And they would meet a couple of times a year. And it was never really clear to me who they were or how they became that person, but they were still there. Very interesting. I'd like to introduce our panel to you now. Joining our discussion is Frank Connolly. Frank is the author of Local Government in Connecticut. It's in its third edition now. Frank has held numerous municipal positions, including as a town manager, a school business official, and other positions in several Connecticut towns. He's currently president of his own firm called Local Government Consultant, LLC. Frank is an adjunct faculty member at the University of New Haven, where he teaches graduate courses in public finance, collective bargaining, and public administration, among other things. Scott Jackson is now the Undersecretary of the Intergovernmental Policy Division of the State Office of Policy and Management, commonly known around the Capitol as OPM. A lifelong resident of Hamden, and Scott tells me he plans to stay there at least until his mortgage is up 26 years from now. Scott was the longest serving mayor of the town. He served 3 terms before resigning to take the appointment by Governor Malloy to OPM. And Scott has worked for Senator Joseph Lieberman and for the Connecticut Policy and Economic Council, a nonprofit that's dedicated to improving the delivery of government services. He also, in recent times, chaired the Governor's Sandy Hook Advisory Commission. So thank you all 3 for being here. Most appreciated. I want to talk a little bit about, Bruce, you were talking about how our government has evolved over the years. So let's talk about something that happened more recently than some of what you talked about, and that is in the 1960s, actually 1960, when county government was abolished. Can you tell us why? First of all, how did county government get started? And why did they determine it had to go?
Right. The counties were set up basically to perform judicial functions on the part of the state. It was very difficult to carry that out on a colony-wide or statewide level, and that was the primary function, was the county courts. They ran a jail. There was a state's attorney for a county to prosecute crime, and there were courts to adjudicate those. Toward the end of the 18th century, they got a few regulatory powers over taverns, and also power to compel towns to repair roads. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that some of the counties took initiatives with roads and bridges. But I think it's fair to say that unlike Massachusetts, where the counties do all the record keeping for local government, unlike New York, where the counties actually build and maintain roads, Connecticut never had strong counties to begin with. At the same time, I think that there is a vacuum there between town and state that we try to do some things with, and that's your regional planning agencies. You have, councils of government and so forth that try to fill some of those functions. I just don't think we were ever large enough to have robust counties.
And I grew up in the state of New York, where there were very robust county governments, so I was surprised when I first came to Connecticut to see that it didn't have that. And Mayor Jackson, I'm going to ask you, what's the strength and what's the weakness of a government system that goes from state to town and has no county in between?
Well, when you take 169 very different communities, you have very different capacities as well, but the rules apply equally to each of those communities. So I was out in the great town of Voluntown last week or 2 weeks ago. Voluntown has 4 full-time employees, and 3 of them work in public works. Mm-hmm. So these day-to-day functions that are well-staffed in the larger communities, it's just much harder to do. I'll give you an example. You can't register your motor vehicle if you owe outstanding property taxes. Mm-hmm. So if you live in Voluntown and you travel to the nearest DMV office, not realizing you can do it online now, you travel to the DMV office and they say, I'm sorry, Mr. Jackson, I can't register your car. You have to pay your taxes and come back with a form saying that your taxes are up to date for me to register you. Well, you may not actually be able to do that. And so that's an area where additional regional cooperation would certainly, I think, offer an enhanced benefit to the residents of those communities.
Frank, I'll ask you, because you've had experience at that level. What is the weakness of government without a county structure?
The weakness of it, well, one of the strengths is we don't pay taxes to a third form of government in the state.
Okay.
That's big.
That's a good thing.
That's big. Many other states have the counties, they perform educational functions and public works functions, where we don't have that as a state. We're only one of two states without a county form of government, Rhode Island being the other one. But the problem is we have 169 municipalities, and we're a very, very small state, each one with its own form of governance. And there is a need to have more intergovernmental cooperation, certainly, and that's where the COGS are coming in, and we're seeing now the consolidation of the regional planning organizations, trying to get our local elected officials working together to see if we can improve the delivery of services. Because when you think about it, the number of superintendents in the state
You mean school superintendents?
School superintendents, as opposed to public works superintendents. But the number of school superintendents on this state in such a small community, such a small state, the duplication of services that we have. Each town has their own functions: a town clerk, a selectman, albeit it might be part-time, but there is a lot of duplication of efforts. Especially if a few towns that are less than 1,000 population in the state.
So, Mr. Jackson, what do we do about that? And, are the towns willing to do anything about it? I've been in Connecticut more than 25 years. I've been hearing about shared responsibilities between towns, regionalism, whatever you want to call it, for all those years, and I don't see all that much evidence that it's really happening.
Well, it's happening at a glacial pace. And this is the land of steady habits, so we can probably expect that. But one thing that I have seen through my former colleagues at COST and CCM and other statewide organizations is that chief elected officials are getting it. They get it. They understand. Now the difficulty is trying to work within their communities to find, what we all call the low-hanging fruit. How can we show our communities that we can combine these services without losing sort of the uniqueness of our independent community? But now, so my town of Hamden was formed as 9 farming villages. So there's already, I could look at it and see, well, you can maintain the integrity of these spaces within a common boundary. It happens all the time. It happens in just about every city and town. But as Bruce said, from a financial standpoint, when we all look at our taxes and say, "Ooh, I don't know if we can continue to move down this road," I don't know that there is such a fundamental difference between the students of Ansonia and the students of Derby that they need 2 separate curriculum directors. I think that we have to be upfront and talk about it. It might take 50 years to get there, but once we start really hammering out some of the financial benefit of doing this, people will start to understand that the COGS are, 2 of our COGS merge, so they have some growing pains, but that's to be expected. But the COGS, I think they really get it, and it's also they're valuable for return on our federal investment dollars. The feds don't like to give monies directly to communities for transportation. They prefer to give it to counties, and so the COGS are kind of our placeholder for those federal dollars. So it's really important for the chief elected officials to be active in their COGS to make sure that federal dollars are flowing back into their communities.
Bruce, you talked about how town government was broken down even further into parishes. So is that what led to the 169 towns that we have in the state, each of it wanting to have their own home rule?
Right. Basically, I would say the majority of our present-day towns started off as parishes within other towns, and by the time they got 30 or 40 families, they wanted to have their own parish, their own militia companies, have control over their road funds, and so they would petition for town status. And one of the monikers of Farmington is the mother of towns. Because so many towns came from it. Some towns were divided up 6, 7 different times, Farmington being one of them. I wanted to say something about the regional government efforts. In the case of the COGS, and also in the case of the regional school districts, it really is an ongoing struggle to maintain the balance of the member towns or the member sending districts. It's something that as an official, you have to constantly keep in mind that I was on the board for Region 19, Ashford, Mansfield, and Willington for 8 years. And one town simply would not coordinate their bus system with the other 2 towns because they had this tradition in town that if you were had part-time work or whatever, you could be a school bus driver, and they didn't want to see that source of part-time work disappear from their town. So they maintained their own bus system even while the other 2 towns work together. And constantly on a regional school board, you deal with that. And the councils of government, the same thing. Towns will say, we don't want to be in this council of government. We're going to leave Hartford and go to Wyndham or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Frank, over the years that you've been involved in local government as well as studying it, writing about it, and teaching it, what have you seen in terms of regional cooperation?
Well, we're seeing it more last several years. I've been working with my associates on the government side. When I went from being a town manager to school business manager, they said I went over to the dark side, working for the Board of Education. But what I find very interesting is the difficulty each of the boards have with their budgets, particularly with regard to special education. And special education is such a burden on the local boards of education, and each school district has to make provision for special ed. And there's almost a duplicate of effort that each town, each Board of Ed is going through. And I certainly think it's one of the areas that we could look at as far as consolidating and trying to work together on different things. You mentioned school bus transportation.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that.
Please, yes.
You're absolutely right. Any municipal leader will tell you that their exposure, their financial exposure in 2015 is in healthcare costs and special education. Yet most districts are not capable of managing their own internal special education program. But if you work together, things like a regional center of excellence for autism spectrum disorders, these things make real sense. But you have to go into it with a partner that you trust. There has to be a trust relationship. And building and maintaining those trust relationships, particularly in an environment where in most places every 2 years there could be a complete change of leadership. Right. It makes it a little bit harder, but it also makes it sort of more incumbent upon new leaders to kind of dive in with both feet and say and really understand their finances and how creating these relationships really matters. A lot of folks when they're first elected are almost timid about leaving the confines of their town. They feel like they have to be present everywhere in their town and they can't devote any time to this, but it really is critical to the future of every community.
Bruce?
I think that one thing that has happened is that the concept of local control has almost reached mythic proportions in Connecticut. And as someone who's a historian and a former local town official, local control, there's so many things you need to do and there's not enough money to do it. It doesn't really matter. That's the basic problem. It's the same everywhere. I think what you said about building trust is important. I think that people will go for these regional entities, for these intertown entities, once they feel comfortable with how it's doing its mission, because they can do it so much more efficiently at so much lower cost. It's definitely going to be worth it. But we do have this mythic almost concept of localism.
Yeah. Frank?
And trust, just not in the intertown, but intra-town. What I find is that having worked on the general government side for many years and now on the Board of Education side, it's like we're on the same railroad track but 2 separate rails. And they don't always come together. And maybe they shouldn't. But when I worked at the town side, I always looked at the Board of Ed and I say, oh my goodness, look at the size of their budget they're putting in for. They're in la-la land. They spend all this money in the end of June. What's wrong with them? And then I went over to the Board of Education side, and after a couple of years, I start looking at town officials and say, they don't understand. So there's a different perspective in each way, but it does require a good amount of trust. And that does not take place in a lot of municipalities between the leadership of the school system and the leadership of the town.
That's a good example, and you could probably answer this question. I think that relatively few towns in Connecticut have consolidated financial administration between the town and the schools.
Very few, less than a half dozen, where
Yeah.
you have the Board of Ed will have their own director of finance or school business manager, and the town has its own finance department. And there are avenues for working together because it's doing the same purchasing. Payroll is a little bit more complex. The Board of Ed is incredibly complex on payroll. But there are areas where there could be more working together.
But that gets to what he was saying about trust.
Yes, very much so.
It's a sense, we don't trust the town is going to do right by the schools, or we don't trust the schools not to waste the taxpayers' money.
Right. And there's also, not only in the sort of back-end operations, but in facilities management, there's a blade of grass owned by the Board of Education, and it's cut by this person at this pay scale with this piece of equipment. Next door is a town park cut by this person with the same piece of equipment. These things don't make a lot of sense, but the question is, if I get a toner spill in my school, I need to make sure that it's going to get cleaned up right now. And the only way that I can guarantee that is if that person who's going to clean it up is under my control, not under the control of the superintendent of public works.
Understood. If anyone has questions, please raise your hand, and Bill Flood will bring the microphone over to you. And I think we do have a question right here.
Mayor Jackson's only used the word once, that's municipality. And I wonder if there is a difference in a legal sense between a town and a municipality. And if there is a difference, I'm assuming there is a difference, how municipalities figure into the system, and whether your conversation has mainly been focusing on towns rather than municipalities.
Well, there's under statute, there's no fundamental difference between town and city. It's sort of choice of the entity, ultimately written into their charter typically. But there are other types of taxing authorities, fire districts, boroughs, things like that around. So when I use the word municipality, it's sort of a term of art to cover just the 169 and not the 300 and some odd taxing authorities.
He's correct in that many statutes in Connecticut use the term municipality, which applies to each of the 169 towns. Some of those are under the selectman form of government that descends from the 1600s. Others have a state-granted charter that provides for town council, say, or town administrator. All the cities in Connecticut have municipal charters that spell out their powers. That started in the right after the American Revolution, when New London, New Haven, Hartford, Norwich, and one other, that Middletown, were given special charters. Now many of our towns have special charters that outline their powers. But basically, a municipality is a town, whether it has selectmen or whether it has charter.
So Frank, let me ask you, why is it that when we go from town to town, some towns have a mayor? Some mayors are a strong mayor. Some mayors are more of a figurehead mayor. Some towns and cities have a first selectman. They don't have a mayor. We have town councils. We have boards of selectmen. What is that all about?
Connecticut has three basic forms of government: mayor, council, selectman, town meeting, and town manager, town council. Those are the three basic forms, and there's some little side trails off with those. But in effect, under home rule, each municipality, cities and towns, each municipality has the right to have the form of government that it so chooses. And the municipality can opt to create a charter revision commission. And the charter revision commission then will determine what form of government that the municipality will have. Will it be a mayor? Will it be a town manager? Will it be a first selectman? That's a choice each of the towns have, and some towns choose not to do it, and they operate under general statutes, as generally as boards of selectmen. So, but each one can choose what they want. And what's interesting, this question comes up a lot: what size do you have to be to become a city? Well, you have the town of West Hartford, which is over 50,000, and you can have cities and down in the Valley, Derby, and so many where you have a mayor and 13,000, 14,000 population. So in effect, there's no population size. It's up to the municipality to say, do we want to be called a town? Do we want to be called a city?
I see.
Do we want to be called a village? Local control. It's a local call.
Interesting. You talked, Bruce, earlier about the town meetings and who was allowed to vote and all that. And I'm wondering, Frank, how many towns still have town meetings where people all can vote, and how many are actually relying on their elected officials to make the decisions, their town councils or their board of selectmen?
Most of the municipalities in the state have the town meeting form of government. That's the largest form. I could look it up in my appendix there. I have the actual numbers are in here.
I don't need the exact number,
but the majority of towns have the selectmen town meeting form of government. There's roughly 31 mayor councils and roughly 30 town manager town councils. So it's over 100 then to have the selectmen town meeting form of government.
So is there any town that I could go to where I, just as a citizen off the street, could vote on making decisions for the town?
Yes, if you own property in that town, even if you don't live in there, if you have owned property, you'll be allowed to vote on the annual budget. You don't have, without being a resident of the town,
Right.
but you have to own a certain level of property within the town to do it.
Scott, tell me from your time in local government and in the position you're in now, where you're observing a number of and having an interest in a number of governments around the state. What do you think about the level of citizen participation in their governments?
I think that it's dwindling, and I have a couple of theories as to why. One is I happen to live 3 miles from the spot where I was born and a mile from the house where my mother still lives, and all my siblings live in town. So we happen to be invested because, my children are third generation Hamden people, but that's unusual. So if you come to Hamden to take on a position as an assistant professor at Yale, you don't really have a connection to the community in the way that a lot of other people did in the past, and our mobile economy keeps people moving at a much more rapid pace. So that's one of the reasons. Another is, I was 2 for Watergate. My entire life has been, if you're in government, you're crooked. You're stealing something. You're trying to get a job for somebody. There's something wrong with your character if you're engaged in government. And so I think that in this world where everything's on a blog somewhere, and your reputation can be impugned in an instant, a lot of people would say, well, yeah, I've got a job. I'm comfortable. I've got 400 channels on my cable TV. I'm not going to go out there and put myself out there to be criticized by my neighbors.
Bruce, you were wanting to say something?
No, I just totally agree with that. That I think that the civil discourse, and I don't want to blame the media, but for example, our town council meetings in Mansfield are broadcast now, and it's the level of vitriol is increasing. You'd think it would decrease if they were on TV, but no. It means that they stand up before the cameras and they say, I have evidence of malfeasance here. And everyone's thinking, I'm not getting paid. Don't accuse me of malfeasance.
Well, that was one of my questions. How has the fact that we now have more public access television, so there is the possibility of covering meetings at a pretty local level, how has television and how has the internet affected local government?
More heat and less light.
More heat and less light.
That's my opinion.
Frank?
Yes, I go along with that. I've seen when television came in and the Freedom of Information laws came in, it dramatically changed the dynamics of a local government. More open public meetings that you have and less, in the back room. Television came in, I've seen it go both ways. I've seen some hot dogs on some of the elected officials, they really need to spout when the TV is on. And then I've seen other council members become more reticent and more quiet. They don't want to talk when the TV camera is on. And I found there's almost a better dialogue when the TV cameras are not on. But I've seen it both ways. But it is an impact,
Well, let Scott have a chance to comment on that.
I agree. I think there's great potential there, but I'm not sure that it's being pushed out there in a way that's necessarily helpful. And from my own perspective, my favorite government actors are the ones who keep their head down and grind it out every day. And so when so much of the air in the room might be taken up by someone who is there because they're DVRing it at home and they want to, show it to all their friends, I don't think it's helpful to the delivery of excellence in government.
Although I would say that, at the Connecticut Network, we're very, obviously our mission is to cover the state government as well as some other governments, but primarily state government. And when CTN was founded over 15 years ago, the big concern among the legislators was there are going to be people who are going to be showboating, and they're just going to be speaking to the camera, and it's going to change the entire level of discourse. And I think what we've seen over the years is that people more or less forget that the camera's there because it is now an intrinsic part of what's happening. So the people who are showboats, if you will, probably would be that way anyway. And it doesn't seem to have affected how business is done. And in fact, what we've heard more recently, now that the Republicans are in the minority in the legislature, is that one of the only ways they feel that people get to hear their voices is the fact that they can hear them on CTN, they can see them, they can watch it on the internet, that they feel that they get more of their message out.
I wanted to bring up one other factor and get your reaction to it. But I find that in local politics, the age thing is just discouraging. Because where I am, or any of the surrounding towns, you look at the town committees, the party committees, and it's all senior citizens. If you go to a local election polling place, the people that roll up are much more the older people, the retired people. And I'm not sure why that has occurred. I know that young people are much busier and with kid activities and so forth, but the graying of local politics is a big concern to me.
I agree with you, and I think, on the other hand, when towns have an opportunity, people have an opportunity to vote on school budgets, that's when young families and younger people really need to show up. I remember covering a school budget crisis in the northwest part of the state where the budget in 1 year was rejected 17 times because senior citizens who didn't have, largely didn't have children in the schools could vote it down, and the younger families weren't showing up in large enough numbers, the younger voters, to push it through. Now, there were also some intrinsic problems with how the budget was developed and all that. I don't want to say it's completely dependent on the demographics, but in part, that's what we saw. But
to a certain extent, to run local government, it's not just showing up for that vote on the school budget. Somebody has to be at that meeting every Monday night, or whatever it is, and you have to sit through the boring testimony, and you have to read the boring reports, and you have to wring your hands because there's not enough money for anything. I mean, somebody just has to do that.
Do we have any questions in the audience, by the way? I'd like to give anyone an opportunity.
I'd like to go back, if I could, to the 169 towns issue. I live in Southington, and it's a very proud town, South Farmington originally. And we have managed to learn to share probate judge with Cheshire and the health director with Plainville. And so far as I can tell, that's as far as we've gotten. What I find interesting is, despite how proud everyone is, if you read the local obituaries, especially older folks these days, they all came from Meriden and New Britain, but they seem to forget that and become very provincial in what they do. I guess on a big picture stage here, we have a big problem in our state with poor cities and wealth distribution and education opportunity problems that I've always felt that a county-type government, although maybe they don't govern those things, would solve a lot of those problems. Can we ever get there? Is that the right avenue? And you look at Hartford and the property taxes that people pay to live in a city that no one in the right mind would do that. But people will live in Glastonbury. How do you bridge that?
I think that's
no
a great
pun
question.
intended.
Yeah.
Well, there are states in which social welfare functions are partly done on the county level. There's no doubt about that. I mean, counties could be arranged so that they took advantage of their larger size and to take a holistic approach to a region in terms of social programs. A lot of counties do education. There's very few states that do statewide education systems, but there are a few. But there are a lot that do county statewide education systems.
Scott, go ahead.
Everything you guys have discussed have been bottom-up type things. They percolate at the local level and they say that I've got half an employee, you've got half an employee, we can have one employee.
Yes.
That is never
Right.
going to happen from the bottom. How is it going to transpire?
Well, for example, the probate judge consolidation was a state effort. That was a statutory effort. Cheshire and Southington didn't get together and decide to do it. The state said, "No, you're going to do this." Hamden and Bethany, you're going to do this, and you're going to run your election, and the winner is going to take the seat. And the probate judge who loses, I'm sorry, you're done.
Yeah. And what needs to happen is what you said about the trust. People have to have that experience with the new probate courts. Oh, this is working out well. If they are efficient, if they're still responsive, if people are still getting the services that they expect, that could be a model for other things to happen on a larger level. How many are there? 9 districts now, probate districts, or?
Oh no, there are
20?
100.
There's 100?
Well, they were 109, I think. I don't remember what they consolidated.
Well, there's a lot
to.
few now.
Yeah.
And they could still be consolidated.
Frank, what about the issue about schools? It struck me when I first moved to Connecticut that you have Bridgeport, within a few miles of Fairfield and Westport, which have excellent schools, and Bridgeport, which struggles. If we had a more regional form of government, would we have better schools?
Tough question. Would you have better schools? I guess it depends on where you're standing. Bridgeport might look at it as better schools, but the surrounding communities may say, well, it's not as good. But certainly there can be more effort of consolidation of services. And just back up a hair, the bigger picture is there's such a strong feeling of what town you're from. When you bump into someone from Connecticut and you're on the West Coast or any place, well, what town you're from. We associate with the towns that we're from. That's very, very strong. So I don't see the abolition of a town, but I do see more consolidation of services, still maintain the town, but consolidation of services. And you talked about previously the custodial maintenance operations between a town and a board of education. Well, that could be expanded. Your public works, your technology is another area for consolidation, your finance, your special education. And so I think that specific services can be consolidated and run in a more efficient manner in a larger area there. Why do we have to have a superintendent for every single school district, even if it's only one school? You have to have a superintendent. Why do we have to have these kinds of things where the statutes could allow a little bit more flexibility, but start looking at what services can we consolidate and work together on? We're still going to maintain 169 municipalities.
And this would be heresy, in my party committee. But why do we have multiple registrars of voters for every community? These are vestiges, to a time past where there were transportation and communication problems. But what it takes to sort of restack the deck is really going to be a lot of hard work. And while some leaders can talk about it, it's really going to have to take the buy-in from the community to say, you know what, I'm not going to lose anything here.
Okay, so that's the question I was going to ask you about buy-in from the community. With all of us feeling the pressure in Connecticut of our tax bills, shouldn't there be some pressure coming from voters to say, hey, you guys, we don't need a superintendent for every town. I don't want to pay for that. We don't need a snowplow in my town, which has 3 roads, when the town next to me has 10 snowplows, and they can come over. Shouldn't there be some kind of pressure coming from the bottom up on that?
Well, I think that people still think that increasing municipal budgets are a management issue. They're not a management issue. You can't effectively manage the cost of healthcare. It's a global issue. You can't manage the cost of special education costs. But I think people still genuinely believe that, you can get out your pencil and cut your way to success here. But my first budget, I laid off 8% of my workforce because that's what people said they wanted. And then when the roads were a mess and the parks were dirty, they all came right back. Because you're paying for something. There's a value proposition, and the folks said, wait a second, that value proposition didn't work out in my favor. And so I still think that municipal leaders maybe need to change the way they talk about their budgets and where the dollars go, and some open government initiatives would certainly be helpful to that. Let people slide their levers, say, okay, what happens if I trim the fire department budget by 10%? This is what happens. So I think giving people some tools to better understand, municipal budgets can be a little bit opaque at times.
And doesn't it seem like that would be something we could do on the internet?
Oh, absolutely, and folks are doing it and trying to figure out how to do it effectively. And this is a case where towns really have to talk to each other. They have to raise their hand in a room of their peers and say, you know what, I tried 3 of them and this one really worked for me, and my residents really understand the budget better. Maybe this is the one that you guys want to take a look at.
I want to wrap up our program by asking each of you to kind of give us your thoughts on how can I make a difference in my town? And how can we get more people involved? And Bruce, I'll let you start.
And the main way I would say would be to start off with a local public office that you think that you can fill within your time budget. Be it the library board, be it work your way up to the zoning board, which is of course a real time commitment, but there are some positions, and just get involved.
Frank, if I have something that's a burning issue to me and I want to get it accomplished in my town, what's the best way to go about doing that?
Understanding the political and financial cycle. If it's going to involve money, you need to know the town's budgetary cycle as to when you want to do it. You don't want to go in the middle of February and say, oh, I want $100,000 for a ballpark. You're too late in the budgetary cycle. You need to understand the budgetary cycle and the ups and downs, and when, from a policy point of view, you want to affect change. You need to understand that. You need to have the contacts with your local officials. If I could just jump back for a second.
Sure.
One of the things I found when I've spoken to all levels of schools, elementary, high school, college, graduate level, one of the things I'd like to do is say, your assignment for tomorrow, the next class, is prepare a list of what local government does for you on your way home and the way back. And then have little groups and compete one another. And what's astounding is that the children, eventually adults, don't realize how much local government affects their daily lives. Every time they go down the street, local government is there. Be it a street light, a school bus, a police officer, a parks and recreation. It's just amazing how much local government affects our everyday lives. More than the state government, more than the federal government. It's right there. And there is not a realization of what local government does for the public and for people. And so I always find that a great exercise. They come in the following class and say, okay, here's what we found, and Team A, how many did you get? And Team B, how many did you get? And have a little competition. But you start to create an understanding of what local government can really do for you and how much it actually does for you. And I think that's so important.
Scott?
I started as a commissioner on the Community Development Advisory Commission in Hamden. That's how I started. Another thing so the boards and commissions are very powerful in introducing folks to aspects of their community that they may not know about. Another thing that I would recommend for those who affiliate with a party, particularly if they're young, is to reach out to the party. They are starved for young people, and they will help you understand how to participate. And then going off of one thing that Frank said, there seems to be a dwindling number of schools that require their students to participate in civic engagement activities. Getting high school juniors and seniors out there in the field, understanding the way government works, and seeing that they can go out there and do something to make their town just a little bit better. Once they get a taste of that, they're much better suited to saying, long term, I'm going to be engaged wherever I should go.
Well, that's something we here at the Old State House and at CTN are very much committed to. I want to thank all 3 of you for being here. It was wonderful. And I want to remind everybody to vote on Election Day because local government matters. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much to our speakers and to everybody who came today. I really love that you talked about trust, because I think that is really the basis of everything. And next month's program on November 18th will be Don't Mince Your Words, Conversations at the Thanksgiving Table. And I think that a lot of these conversations about government and politics really start at the family table, and that's a great place to develop trust and the ability to speak openly and to explore ideas together. So I really love that that came up, and I thank all of you. That was a really great discussion. Thanks to everybody.